We are in the arena again this evening for the penultimate episode of this short mini-series. And tonight in the arena, we get to platform number 10, which is Stranded at World's End. Now, hi, welcome. Good to have you with us. I'm Carol. Marianne, welcome. It's lovely to have you with us. See. We are at chapter 10, or platform number 10 in the arena, and the title sounds strange, Stranded at World's End, but it will make sense as we go into it. Now remember, we have been studying Philippians chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, and hopefully you all know it by now. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, so that somehow to attain to the resurrection from the dead. And we've learned about the principles and the meaning of this verse. Remember, this verse is experienced in the reverse. And we've been using Isabel Kuhn's book called In the Arena to discover the many practical ways in which the principles of this book, or the principles of Philippians 3:10, are worked out in our lives practically as Christians. God places us in the arena or on the platform of difficult circumstances in order that we may come to know him much better. Now remember, Isabel gets the title of her book from 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 9, which says that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession like men condemned to die in the arena. And then Paul says we have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to men. And we're going to see that word spectacle coming up a few times this evening. Isabel Kuhn says that the different trials of us Christians are like so many platforms in this world's arena of today. The unbeliever looks on at our struggles and is only impressed or influenced if they can see the power of God working there. And she reminds us that the purpose of this arena experience is not for our punishment, but for God to be revealed, for God's glory to be revealed. Hudson Taylor, who's the founder of the China Inland Mission that Isabel Kuhn was a missionary with, put it this way. He said that difficulties or trials afford a platform upon which God can show himself to us. Without them, we would never know how tender, faithful, and almighty our God is. Now, these arena experiences, remember, God allows in our lives, and they are really opportunities that God gives to us, gifts that he gives to us to become more like Jesus, to practice being like Jesus. He gives us a chance to die, a chance to act as Christ would, a chance to practice following in his footsteps, doing things the way Jesus did them. And then also a chance to experience the power of his resurrection at work in our lives as we live beyond our own strength. And in turn, this then leads to a deeper knowledge and understanding of Jesus, our Savior, his love and his faithfulness towards us, as well as a deepened faith and trust in him. When we begin to see him at work in our circumstances, when we experience the power of his resurrection, it leads to a deeper and more intimate knowledge of Jesus and a deepened faith and trust in him. But it also leads others who look on at our lives to see and recognize his glory. Hudson Taylor used to hang a plaque in his home with two Hebrew words on it. They were the words Ebenezer and Jehovah Jireh. And Ebenezer means, hitherto has the Lord helped us. That's looking to the past. And of course, Jehovah Jireh from Genesis 22 means the Lord will see to it, or the Lord will provide. And so whether Hudson Taylor looked back to the past or looked forward to the future, he knew that the Lord was at work and therefore he had nothing to fear. In other words, it was because he could look back on God's faithfulness that he could therefore have confidence in the future that God would take care of him. And that's what tonight's arena or platform is about. How the troubles and seeming detours of life, what John Piper likes to call the unplanned place, and having to walk at the unplanned pace of obedience to God, those unplanned detours and troubles and trials, how they are allowed in our lives specifically to reveal to us God's great provision and faithfulness, not just to us, but also to those who watch us, who watch our lives. So let's jump straight into this chapter, and then we'll get to the lessons a little bit later. Well, we left Isabel Kuhn last time, you remember, at her mission station, Oak Flat. And remember how she had to move from Oak Flat Mission Station to Village of the Olives because of that whole disaster and sad situation with Pade John and Kades Separ. Now, just to remind you, that is where the Oak Flat Village is. This, remember, is a map of Yunnan province in China. Oak Flat Village is over there. There's another one for you over there. And I finally found a picture of the kind of house she had. Remember, she speaks about her wonderful house on the foot of the abyss, or overlooking the abyss, that was so nice and private. Well, there's the picture for you. Would you like to live there? Okay, well, there we go. So she moved from Oak Flat Village to Village of the Olives. And she moved in December 1948, and 4 months later, by April 1949, there was a new danger approaching them in that southern area of China, and the danger was communism. Now, the usual modus operandi of the communists in an area that they want to take over is to come and stir up raids and destabilize and unsettle an area by sending in bands of robbers and bandits and so on raids and acts of terrorism. Once the area is unsettled, then they can march in and take over. And by 1949, the communists were already entrenched in the Mekong Valley. There's a lovely colored photo of it. That's over the mountains to the east of Oak Flat. So there's Oak Flat. And because I haven't got a pointer, I just thought I'd do that. That's the Mekong River, which is obviously where the Mekong Valley flows through. So they were already in Mekong Valley and in the Luda district to the north, as well as in the Selwyn Canyon. Now that's the Selwyn River, and that's the canyon where their mission station was, right up in the mountains. So the communists were already there by 1949, and by Christmas 1949, there was a terrible battle between the communists and landlord Duan. Do you remember landlord Duan, who won against the other landlord last time? And he won only because he was prepared for them. But right after that victory, the governor of the province of Yunnan gave the province over to the communists. And that meant that landlord Duan had to make peace with the communists, otherwise he wouldn't survive. And that meant that he would no longer be there to protect the missionaries. So by the end of 1949, beginning 1950, it was now becoming very clear that Isabel would have to get out of China. Danny, her little son, was now 6 years old, and he needed to go to school, and it was now impossible for him to go to the CIM mission school because of the communist uprisings and the fighting with the nationalist forces of General Chiang Kai-shek. And so the only thing open to her was to travel as a refugee through Burma. Remember, they were on the border with Burma, where their Oak Flat, just over the mountains of the Selwyn Canyon was Burma. So the only way out was to travel as a refugee through Burma and then on to America in order to get out of China. She'd written to the CIM Home Director asking them to contact the American Baptist Mission Society in, now I've tried 100 times to get this pronounced, Michikina in Burma. Let's go for Michikina. promising to refund any monies that they would maybe need to draw from them in case they needed to evacuate. And they assured her that they would send the letter then to the American Baptists, who would then would give her the money she needed, and that the China Inland Mission would then refund them. So, they had one last RSBS. Do you remember the rainy season Bible school? And that was in February of 1950, and it was the biggest one that they'd ever had, with Lisu coming from as far as Burma, and many new converts through the evangelistic outreach of the students that they sent every weekend to evangelize the area. And so John decided that he was going to stay on in China, ever the optimist, hoping that the communists would then allow the missionaries to stay and that maybe Isabel could come and rejoin him later. And this is where we take up the story. She writes, at the end of the school, Danny and I had to make preparations for our departure. It would be 2 weeks trekking through the jungle of Upper Burma. John offered to go with me, but with all these new converts to supervise, I felt that it would be better if he stayed. And when Lucius, remember their dear friend Lucius, when he offered to be my escort, we decided to accept him. The parting with Daddy was one of the hardest we'd ever had. I felt myself that I would not get back, that communism would never allow evangelistic Christianity to work under their regime. John is an optimist by nature, but even then, when we were saying goodbye, he had to force a smile. We left him on a high rock jutting out from the road, biting his lips in grim determination. And we set our faces towards a track that would take us halfway around the world. And now we were on our way to America. First came the Pigeon Pass. You've heard of the Pigeon Pass a few times. This is a modern picture of it with an actual road, all right? When they passed this pass, it was just a cow trail. It is 10,998 feet in elevation. That is 3,350 meters high. Or if you like, 1,015 stories high. We left Village of the Olives on March the 10th. That night we slept among rice fields by the side of the Selwyn River. March 11 we climbed, pressing through to the town of Lugang, and there we learned that the new communist official was due to arrive the next week. He would never have allowed us to leave, and so we had escaped just in time. The third day we were still climbing, but now on the sides of the great Pienma mountain itself. That night we slept in a hamlet called Erchocho, the last house on the slopes below the pass. And the next morning when I woke up early, to my dismay, I heard the pitter-patter of rain on the roof. Now that meant, if it was raining on the bottom part of the mountain, that meant that on the top it was snowing. And the trail across the top of the pass would be obliterated. All that day it rained, all the next night, and all the next day. My carriers, who were dear Christian boys, most of them farmers in Village of the Olives, began to talk about going home. Snow will have closed the pass, they argued, and the weather looked like a good 10-day rain, after which the ground will be just right for ploughing. There was no use trying to get over the pass. We have to turn around and go back to Olives. Well, you can imagine how I felt and how I prayed. To go back to Olives meant that Danny would have to go through that whole communist ordeal after all, with imprisonment or internment, not to speak of the moral dangers from the Village of the Olives, 2/3 of which were still heathen. Remember, her own daughter had been in the Japanese concentration camp. Then he was invited, I've just lost my place. As a matter of fact, she says, John was allowed wonderful freedom for 1 year after the communist officials arrived. Then he was invited out at the end of a bayonet and forced to trek right over China, even though it would have been quicker to just exit into Burma. That was a year later. So in desperation I prayed, and as I prayed, an idea came to me. Boys, I said, If we turn back tomorrow to olives because of the weather and then the sun comes out, wouldn't you feel foolish? And you know that it would be a great loss of money for me. Let's arrange it this way and pray for God's guidance. If when we wake up tomorrow morning, it's not raining, then we can take that as a sign from God that we can start out. On the other hand, if we reach the snow line and it begins to snow or the trail is difficult to find, I will consent to going back with you. I know that people die every year going over the Pigeon Pass in times of snow, and I don't want to endanger you or ourselves. But I have experienced or found that if we go as far as we can, God often opens up the rest of the way. Will you do it? They all agreed, for they were all Christians, and we really had wonderful fellowship together. You can imagine how I strained my ears at about cockcrow the next morning. There was silence. The pitter-patter on the roof had ceased. Throwing something over me, I went to the door and looked out. Not promising, heavy storm clouds lay low over the hills and the air was damp, but it wasn't raining. When I went back in, I found Lucius making the fire for breakfast. And so I told him to call the others up so that we could start out. No one looked thrilled. The trail will be obliterated, Mama, after 2 days and nights of such a snowstorm, Lucius warned quietly. If it is, I will turn back with you, I promised. But let's go and see. I was counting very much on the fact that it wasn't actually raining, the sign that we had asked for from God. And so we set out. As we began that climb that would take us all of the morning, the sun shot forth in one golden stream upon us. But only for a moment. Then it disappeared behind clouds, and a thin drizzle of rain descended. We were climbing through dark and lonely vegetation, up and up. The rain stopped, but we were now among the clouds, which, as you know, is like being in a fog. We all know that here in Walvis Bay. It is wet and depressing. I was riding our mule Jasper. Now, I couldn't find a picture of her own mule, but there's a picture of Elisu on the mountains with a mule. That is how they transported goods. And Danny was being carried in a mountain chair, which is like a stretcher with a seat instead of a bed, on the shoulders of Canaan and Daniel. The Lisu, who were usually very merry and cheerful on the road, were silent, and I was wondering whether it was right for me to endanger their lives. Should I call a halt and go back? I was praying for guidance when through the fog up above us on the rocky crescent loomed 2 black figures. They spied us as we spied them, and both parties shouted. The next instant, they were down beside us. 2 Lisu from the Luda district. They were returning from a trading trip in Burma and had just crossed over the pass. How's the top? Our men shouted. The snow is deep, but we are a large party and you can find your way by our footprints if you hurry. Ah, Bear, didn't we have a hard time? The first fellow said, delighted that their lives were spared, for the trail would be easy from now on. They sprang on down the slope, passing us. When you reach village of the Olives, please tell Ma Pa, remember her husband, Ma Pa, that you saw us. I called to them. We'll do that, they called back, and the cloud swallowed them up. Now our men pushed upward with new vigor. Further on, 2 more of this Luda party met us. It's beginning to snow at the top of the pass, one of them answered our eager inquiries. But you can make it. Watch out for our footprints. There's nothing else to show you where the trail is. It was now noon, and all of us were hungry, but we didn't dare waste time making a fire and cooking lunch. I had 1 slice of bread and a small piece of cheese left, and this I divided with Danny when we finally arrived at the top of the Pigeon Pass. Now this usually presents a most marvelous view, with China spread out before you on one side and Burma on the other. But now almost everything was covered with snow clouds. On the China side, the sun was trying to struggle through, but on the Burma side, everything was dark. In fact, it was beginning to snow in tiny half-wet flakes which melted immediately when they touched us. The trail over the top of Pigeon Pass is only a cow path in width. It winds backwards and forwards on a level for a short distance before plunging down into the steep descent. We met more Ludelisu shivering as they struggled on towards the China side, but their feet had sunk deeply into the snow, marking out the trail for us. It was God's provision. We waited until our party was all together, the slower ones catching up with us who led the way, and then we began to cross the paths. We hadn't gone very far when Jasper suddenly sank to his stomach in the snow. I had to dismount, and with Samson pulling at his head and Lucius jerking him by the tail, shame poor mule, they finally got the mule out and on the trail again where the snow was not so deep. I climbed on his back once more, but heard a call from behind me. Can we carry Danny Pickerback, Mama? We can't make it with this big awkward chair. All right, I called back as Jasper floundered and snorted and the snowstorm grew thicker and heavier. And so one of the Lisu carried Danny on his back and Daniel carried the empty chair. Danny had a raincoat and rubber hat on, and so the snow sleet just dripped off him easily. He was the most comfortable one on the whole trip and cheered the rest of us with his joyful singing at the top of his voice. As for me, the snow melted off me and ran into my galoshes. Soon my feet were in pools of snow water and I lost all feeling up to the knees. I was soaked to the waist as well because my plastic raincoat kept slipping back off my knees. Of course, as I reached the lower altitudes, the snow changed to rain, and the steep path became muddy and slippery. Finally, Jasper couldn't keep his feet and was beginning to slide dangerously. You'll have to get off, Mama, said Samson at last. And so I had to jump off, trusting that my feet would hold me up, even though I'd lost all feeling in them. Lucius helped me, and so we continued to slip and slide down the mountain. It was 4:30 in the afternoon before we reached the pretty valley where Pigeon Pass village nestled. But nobody invited us into their homes. There are a couple of guest houses up on the hill, they said to us coolly, pointing to 2 empty shacks which didn't look like they were in good repair. There was nothing to do but to camp in them as best we could. But we were out of communist China. True, we had no visa to enter Burma. Janke, no visa. And we still had 10 days trekking through the jungle before we would come upon civilization. And even after we reached Michikina, Danny and I would still be halfway across the world from home. There was plenty to think about, but at least we were over the pass. After supper, the storm began again with violence. It hailed outside once, and then rain came spatting down. And now I knew it would be snowing hard on the pass and would blow all night, and so the pass would be closed. In other words, we couldn't go back. We were shut up to going forward. But what if I got lumbago from sleeping in damp bedding? I'd caught it some years before, and that time the bedding was drier than this time, and with lumbago I couldn't walk or ride a horse all day, no matter how much I summoned all my willpower. I was helplessly cast upon the Lord. Was I really in His will to come? This time He hadn't given me a Bible verse on which to lean. I'd asked for one, but none was given. It would have been so comfortable to have a Bible verse to stand on like I had in my experience of 1942. This was 8 years later, and you know, God expects His children to grow. I believe it was D.E. Host, and I've got a picture of him. He was the one who followed on after Hudson Taylor as the director of the CIM. He said that the older he grew, the harder it seemed to be to get guidance from the Lord. And I believe he meant that guidance becomes less simple. God expects us to exercise spiritual discernment. And He guides us by a certain pressure on the Spirit, or by a still small voice, by something so delicately intangible that unless you are carefully tuned into His Spirit, so to speak, you can miss it. It requires a close and experienced walk with the Lord. And so in one sense, He has a hold on us that He wouldn't otherwise have if He just gave us a Bible verse every time we asked for one. But when it is only a still small voice to be our guide, it's easy for Satan to throw us into confusion by causing us to question whether we've heard it aright. It is a good plan never to go back on past guidance. And yet how patient is our Master. He never deserts us. I never got lumbago or even rheumatism. And we had to travel in the rain more than once after that, for the storm continued. But the road was not as bad as you may be thinking. True, it took us through the jungles of Upper Burma, but the British, when they were in power in Burma, had caused fairly good roads to be cut and to be maintained through to the Pigeon Pass. Remember, they needed that to get supplies into China during World War II. And every 10 or 15 miles, they'd built rest houses. And these were just simple rustic bungalows built in a clearing in the jungle with a native person to take care of it. There were beds without mattresses or bedding because each traveler carried their own, and a table and a chair, but the caretaker would cook a decent meal for you. Now, the Japanese had destroyed all the rest houses nearer to the border, and so we didn't come across one for several days. But once we did, I was in my element because I was sure of at least a good, clean rest at night. But before we reached these, we arrived at a place where a Lisu Christian from the Salwean Canyon lived. We stayed at his house, and the next morning a message reached us. Mrs. Kuhn was to report to the Burmese official immediately. Knowing I had no visa to enter Burma, I had to comply, even though it meant I had to saddle Jasper and go riding back up the mountain to the official's residence. The effort proved to be well worth it, however. The official was a Karen Christian, also one of the tribe's people. And he told me so himself and gave me some good advice about what to do in my visa-less state. I must report to the police as soon as I arrive at any point of importance, whether it's Michikina, there you can see why I can't pronounce that word, up there, and or Rangoon, down below in Burma. And then by shortwave radio, he would advise the police at Michikina of my approach. But he also sent word to the American Baptist missionary who was in residence at Michikina, the Reverend Herman Tegenveld. Now, I'll just give you another map, a slightly different one, so you can see there's that Michikina and Rangoon, and there is Reverend Herman Tegenveld, who perhaps would meet us with his jeep. There was a motor road which would save us 2 days' travel if we could get a vehicle on it. I thanked the official and our party went back down the hill on our way. In between the rest houses, the road was cut through dense jungle and wild animals abounded. And one morning we found the fresh spoor of a tiger in the mud. So we all had to keep together at such times, but the Lord protected us all the way. And we reached the motor road and the rest house beside it. We inquired about a truck, which we told was not coming around frequently, maybe once a week. So all the following morning we prayed and waited. And you can imagine my feelings when about noon, a motor toot was heard coming down the road. We all ran out to look, and there was a red Jeep with Mr. Tegenveld and 2 of his children, Alice and John. They had brought a picnic lunch, which was prepared by his beautiful wife. At the sight of those fine sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, I felt we had reached civilization at last. Now, Michikina is perhaps the most important city in Upper Burma. It has an airport and the Irrawaddy River flows by it. Here the Techenfelds live, and from here with its city, church and school, they kept in touch with a large country work among all the tribes of Upper Burma. But one of my first questions was concerning the letter that headquarters had promised to write to Mr. Techenfeld, guaranteeing a refund of any sums of money advanced to me. No such letter had come, said Mr. Techenfeld. I cannot tell you my dismay and the alarm that filled me. The title of this chapter may sound far-fetched to the reader, but it is descriptive of my feelings rather than my actual condition. I was now at the other end of the world from home. I had practically no Burmese money. I did not speak their language, and I had no one in the whole country to guarantee me. Moreover, I didn't understand the mission's silence. It was a time of great stress for everybody, and mistakes were possible. I was in a turmoil of questions, and I felt stranded at the end of the world. Well, the first thing to do is cast out fear. The only fear a Christian should entertain is a fear of sin. All other fears are from Satan, who sends them to confuse and weaken us. How many times did the Lord not tell his disciples, "Be not afraid"? And so alone in our bedroom in the Techenfeld's nice home, I knelt by the bed and spread my heart before him. I refused to be afraid, and I asked the Lord to cast out such fears from my heart. Then I had to seek light for my next step. I have to report to the Burmese police, but after that I would have to find a way to get some money. We still had some of Grandpa Kuhn's legacy in the Bank of John's hometown in in Pennsylvania, and I had blank checks from that bank with me. But who would believe that I really had the money back home? Would the Techenfelds trust me? They'd never met me before, and they only knew that there was a Kuhn family working in the Selwyn Canyon. Rather timidly, I asked Mr. Techenfeld if he would cash a check for me, quite a large one, because I found out that I had to fly to Rangoon because the railway had been bombed and there were no trains going. No, sorry, I don't think I can, replied Mr. Techenfeld. Why don't you go onto the street and try and sell it? He didn't even offer to come along and guarantee me. But I found out later why he was so unconcerned. He knew that an endorser wouldn't be required and didn't guess my doubts. Now, she was able to actually cash her check at a shop with a tall, bearded and turbaned Hindu man who didn't even ask to see her passport. Apparently, Christian missionaries were so trusted in Burma in that day that they could cash a check anywhere without a guarantor. Isn't that saying something about the standard of the Christian missionaries in that country? Well, so far so good. Now to Rangoon. Mr. Techenfeld took me to the police, helped me with all the red tape involved. But where would we stay in Rangoon? The Techenfelds gave us the address of a missionary guest house where they always stayed, and I wired them to inquire if they could accommodate us, but I received no answer. Lucius and another Lisu boy rode with us to the airport, and it was hard to say goodbye. I felt that I would never see him again on earth, and I have not. But just before we boarded the plane, a note was handed to me by a passenger getting off it. Once we were up in the air, I opened it, and it was signed Eric Cox. Now, the only thing I could find a picture of Eric Cox was a really horrible one like that, but you get an idea. Oh, how I thank the Lord! Eric had been working among the Atsikation tribe way to the south of us in Yunnan. And his dear friend Grace Little Cox had died on furlough, and I knew that he was also hoping to go home to America to see his children, and that he planned to go via Burma. Only I didn't know when he was leaving. That's the Cape Atsikation tribe with J.O. Fraser. The note said that he was at the guest house when my telegram had arrived, and hearing the hostess say that she didn't have room for us, he'd made arrangements for us to stay with the Bible Churchmen's Missionary Society's deaf school, and he hoped to meet us at the airport. What could have been more wonderful? Psalm 59 verse 10, my God with his loving kindness will meet me, had been fulfilled again. I was thrilled. Maybe we could even travel on the same ship with Uncle Eric, and Danny would have the pleasure of his companionship. Eric had been a sea officer holding a master's certificate when God called him into missionary service, and so there was nothing about a ship that he wouldn't be able to teach a little boy. But I still had an unknown adventure to go through before we reached Rangoon, as if this wasn't enough of an adventure. The aeroplane, we were told, would only come down once before Rangoon, and that would be at Mandalay. So there's Mandalay. But lo and behold, we came down instead at Barmo. Now here Isabel recounts how she became involved in smuggling a letter out for Dr. Gordon Seagrave and his sister Grace Seagrave from the Namkham Hospital. You can go and look it up and you can read the whole story of what happened. There had been an uprising of the Karen tribes people, and Gordon was falsely charged with treason because of helping them. Their mail had been intercepted, and so they couldn't get their side of the affair out to friends. They had driven 60 miles that day in the hopes that there would be someone on the aeroplane who could take the letter to the American consul in Rangoon to explain their side of the situation. And here was Isabel, whom they knew about because John had visited them just the previous year. The Lord's coincidences, hey? While Grace Seagrave kept talking, in a moment when the officials turned their backs, she quickly passed the letter to Isabel, who now carried on her person something which, if was discovered, would actually end up with her in prison. Dr. Gordon Seagrave actually did end up in prison for quite a few months because of this, and Dr. Grace, his sister, actually died of heart trouble the following year. Isabel was really worried that they would be searched when they finally landed in Rangoon, but because they landed so late, the official said, I'm sure you're okay, go. So they didn't even search her. And at a later time in Rangoon, they did ask to see her pocketbook in which the letter was, but by then she had safely delivered it to the consul. She continues, I delivered it into his own hand myself. And the next year, when the affair came out in Time magazine, I had the satisfaction of knowing that at least the Seagrave side of the matter had been presented to the American authorities. Now on to the BCMS Deaf School, where we were kindly received by Miss Sturman and her fellow worker. Eric Cox had missed us at the airport, but came around the next morning and took me to downtown Rangoon, to the police station, immigration offices, the American consulate, everywhere. He'd just been through all the red tape for himself, and so he knew where the various buildings were and how to help me. I had hoped that we would be able to get a passage on a ship from Rangoon, but learned that ships were very few, and so I would need to book space 6 months ahead. The only other way out was to fly to Hong Kong. You got to fly back to Hong Kong and then to try for a freighter there. Eric himself was going to do this and soon had to leave us, but promised that he would telegraph us if there was a possibility of us getting out on the same ship. The CIM had a treasurer in Hong Kong, which meant that if we got there, our money problems would all be ended because we would be able to draw from him what we needed. The telegram came. Boat leaving Saturday, Eric. We read it with a sigh, for we would not possibly make it by then. Being Canadian, I had to go through a long process to get into the United States, including a physical examination and shots for this and for that. And there had to be intervals of time between the shots, and so we couldn't hurry. And so we had to relinquish all hope of having Uncle Eric on the same ship with Danny. At length we were finished and we were ready to fly to Hong Kong. The only bookings we could get were on Siamese Airways, and these had a stopover of 1 day in Bangkok. one day in Bangkok next door. Well, Siam, or Thailand as it is now called, didn't interest me much. It never entered my mind that I would ever return there. In fact, they did. When they couldn't go back to China after the communist takeover, they went back to northern Thailand, where there were also Lisu tribes. So she ended up going back there. To me, it was merely a 36-hour stopover. For some unknown reason, we were not booked at the same hotel as all the other passengers, but instead were sent to the Ratanakosin Hotel, the most modern and expensive hotel in Bangkok. And ladies, can you believe it? I found a photo of that hotel in 1950. There it is, and there it is today. Okay. We arrived on the Saturday when Eric Cox was to sail out of Hong Kong, and the next day was April 9th, Easter Sunday. I inquired about English church services, but couldn't get any information from the desk, and so we ventured out into town to find a missionary community. We eventually found the American Bible Society, and Mr. and Mrs. Marvin Martin received us cordially and invited us to dinner. But the English service would only be that evening, and as I wished to get Danny to bed early in preparation for the early flight the next Monday morning, I took him back to the hotel. As we walked through the lobby, the desk clerk called to me, "Telephone, ma'am." I wondered who could be calling me. It was the Siamese Airways. "We find you do not have a visa for Hong Kong for your son Daniel, Mrs. Kun." Have you been there, ladies? "You may not proceed tomorrow." "But he's only 6 years old. He doesn't need a visa," I gasped. Rachel? My daughter had the same problem trying to come back to Namibia. Some person decided that she needed a visa to come back, even though she has permanent residence. Anyway, "When you get a visa for him, you may proceed, and not until then, madam," was the short reply, and they hung up. My face must have betrayed my feelings, for Danny pulled at my skirt, asking anxiously, "What is it, Mama? What is it?" "You don't have a visa for Hong Kong," was all I could answer, for my heart was like lead, and I wanted to get out of sight and cry. Stranded in Bangkok, and at the most expensive hotel with no money. I pulled out my little checkbook on the hometown bank. "May I pay my bills by check?" I asked the clerk. You should have seen the contemptuous amusement on his face. "No, madam, you may pay in American cash or Siamese money. We do not accept checks." I turned and sought the elevator and our bedroom. Once there, I fell on my knees by the bed and sought the dear Lord. "Oh God, undertake for me," I cried. "Whatever shall I do? I don't know a soul in this country. The Martins were very kind to give us a meal, but they are utter strangers. Oh Lord, speak to me." And I pulled out my Bible and desperately opened it. There before me was Isaiah 65, verse 24. "Before they call, I will answer." "That's a very good verse, oh Lord," I said, still uncomforted. "But how does that apply to us now?" As I waited before him, my memory was illumined. Why, of course! How could I have been so stupid? Quickly, I pulled my purse over to me and slipped back the zipper to an inner pocket. Yes, it was still there. An American $10 and $5 bill. Before they call. Our mail in China was so interrupted that we received only a few batches of it those last 6 months of 1949. But in those 2 batches had been a card once and a note once from a lady in California who was a stranger to me. With the note, she had enclosed a $5 bill, and with the Christmas card, a $10 bill. And both had come through safely, even though there were brigands and robbers all over the place. I couldn't use them in Lisuland, so I put them into the secret pocket of my purse to use on the trip home, but I'd forgotten about them. That lady, the giver, I never did meet, and she ceased to be interested in us after that. But the Lord surely used her to bless us that year. From the depths of my despair, I was lifted into joyous worship of him. How wonderful to find him always there when we have an unexpected need of him. That living touch with him is so precious. It makes him so real, and it obliterates the line between earthly and heavenly. It is so humbling to find him waiting there. And our hotel bill, by the way, was just $10. On Easter Monday, the British consulate was open for only an hour in the morning, but time enough to get the visa, a visit to Siamese Airways, and our passages for Tuesday were booked. On Tuesday morning, we boarded the plane for Hong Kong, and as we descended the gangplank in Hong Kong, we heard a shout of greeting. There behind the wire netting was, any guesses? Eric Cox with Sally Harbison of old Union days. We had to go through immigration and customs first. The immigration officer examined Danny's passport. Oh, you are the people who were held up in Bangkok for the little boy's visa. Yes, sir. Well, it wasn't needed. Juniors do not need a visa for Hong Kong. Why was it allowed? Satan trying to harass? I don't know. There are many apparently needless trials in life, but the Lord stands with us through all of them. May you lose nothing in the furnace but your dross, said Samuel Rutherford. The Lord will preserve everything else for us. He'd even kept Uncle Eric for Danny's boat trip home because the boilers of the ship on which he was to travel had broken down and was delayed just long enough to get us all aboard. Thy loving kindness, O Lord, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And we had a great reception when we finally met friends in Vancouver, and the same from others as we passed to Seattle. And then on by train to meet our daughter Catherine at Wheaton College, right over the United States in Illinois. It was wonderful to see Catherine again, all grown up with an adult mind and the ability to share life's problems with understanding. And our fellowship rose to a new level. We arrived just 1 month before commencement. Who would be able to find a place in Wheaton then? A student who saw that he was going to fail his exams decided suddenly to go home and left a bedroom vacant in the very house where Mrs. Ella Graham had an apartment. And so we had a room right near the college and meals with kind Aunt Ella. A beautiful little college town. That's Wheaton College. And an idea of Wheaton town. Wide streets, trees shaded with squirrels scampering happily from branch to branch. No more air raid alarms, no windows iron barred against thieves. Just peace and plenty and the beauty of spring and young voices. Family life, friendships and freedom. It was like heaven on earth, and I will never forget it. Halfway across the world he had brought us. Through snowy heights and wild jungle, bombed bridges and railways, past suspicious immigration officials with endless red tape regulations, soldiers and tension everywhere, Chinese money, Burmese money, Siamese money, Hong Kong money, oh, let's never mention the word again. He supplied every need as it arose, and each time in a different way. Stranded at world's end? Maybe. But if we lean back, we will find ourselves on the bosom of Christ, that sweet familiar place. Sometimes on the rock I tremble, faint of heart and weak of knee, but the steadfast rock of ages never trembles under me. It was an enriching experience to have found him living and quick to bless in all those strange countries. I realize now that I had unconsciously began to lean on the mission for my financial needs. It had been a rude jolt to find myself cut loose and forced to trust God directly. as Hudson Taylor once commented when a newspaper reporter described him as leading a hand-to-mouth existence? Yes, but it is from God's hand to my mouth. And I ended up being so glad that it happened just that way, so that I might know again the thrill of God's hand to my mouth. And so the platform ended with His power being manifested to me again, and a fresh knowledge of Himself given. Well, ladies, that is always, isn't it, the end result of all these arena experiences that we've been looking at over the last 10 weeks. There's a song by Andre Crouch, an oldie, but a goodie, called Through It All. Anyone know that song? There's a verse in the song that says this: I thank God for the mountains, and I thank Him for the valleys, and I thank Him for the storms He's brought me through. Really? Why? For if I never had a problem, I wouldn't know that God could solve them. And I wouldn't know what faith in His word could do. And then the chorus goes, do you know it? Through it all, I've learned to trust in Jesus. I've learned to trust in God. Through it all, I've learned to depend upon His word. But you see the word there? Learned. How else will we learn if He doesn't give us the troubles? So Isabel Kuhn says, these platforms or struggles in life don't necessarily make us stronger Christians. And I want to be sure that you understand me. Many victories don't make you a stronger Christian, but it does give us an experience of Christ's ability to help us, so that the next time it's easier to trust Him. It is fatal to think that you have become strong. In fact, Paul is going to go on in the very next verses we're going to study in Philippians chapter 3 to say, not that I've already obtained all this, but I press on towards the goal. You see, God's past grace, Ebenezer, gives me confidence for His future grace. The Lord will provide, Jehovah Jireh. Platforms, says Isabel, do not make us stronger Christians or better Christians, but they do make us richer Christians. Rich in our inner fellowship with Him. Rich in our confidence that He will be our rock and deliverer in the future. And rich in the relaxation of a little child who leans back on her father's breast, confident and secure and satisfied. And ladies, I want to add one more thing here. And that is that these platforms also become a stage on which God's power and grace can be revealed to others who are watching us on these platforms and in these difficulties. John Newton, who lived from 1725 to 1807, anyone remember the famous hymn written by John Newton? Amazing Grace, yes. How sweet the sound. Well, John Newton loved to compare faithful Christian sufferers to the burning bush that Moses saw in Exodus. And in his book of the Letters of John Newton, Tony Ranke writes a summary of Newton's view of trials, and I think this is the key lesson for us from tonight. Some Christians, he says, are called to endure a disproportionate amount of suffering. Such Christians are here's that word again, a spectacle of grace to the church and to unbelievers. Like flaming bushes unconsumed, which cause us to ask, like Moses, why is this bush not burned up? The strength and the stability of these believers can be explained only by the miracle of God's sustaining grace. And the God who sustains Christians in unceasing pain is the same God with the same grace who will sustain me in my smaller little trials. And so we marvel at God's persevering grace and grow in our confidence in Him as He governs our lives. Do you see what He's saying? Watching believers suffer and die well, watching believers on their arena platform that God has put them on, watching them helps us to see how God helped them and gives us courage then for our trials. It's not an unusual thing for Christians to be happy in prosperity. That's natural, even expected. But to have joy and peace and trust in God when everything is going wrong requires supernatural power. And that's what causes the world to sit up and take notice, like Moses in the burning bush. They're forced to step aside and say, but what's going on here? Why is that person not destroyed? Now, Vanita Reisner, whose writings I can really recommend to you, and I'm going to send you the link to a video of telling her story tonight when I send the link later. I've quoted from her a few times. She's been through a lot in her life. But commenting on this image of Tony Ranke's, she says this: few of us will end up giving our lives for the gospel. Some of us who proclaim Christ will do so through indescribable and extraordinary suffering. But all of us can show the surpassing worth of Christ to others through our mundane, often daily trials. People want to see how we respond to our challenging children, to our chronic pain, to that difficult boss, to our financial struggles, our ailing parents, our unwanted singleness. The situations that we wish were most different are likely the places that others are watching us most closely. They are each, therefore, and notice what she calls them, a precious opportunity, there's that word again, to share how Christ meets us in our suffering. Don't waste your suffering, she says, using John Piper's phrase. It is far too valuable. God is using it in 1,000 ways that you will never see or know, but one way is to advance the gospel. And then she quotes Philippians 1 verse 12, where Paul says, I'm in prison, but it has turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. Tell people about the hope in you, how God has met you, why your faith has made a difference in your trials. It is the most powerful witness you have. And isn't that just what Isabel Kuhn has done for us over the last 10 weeks, ladies? Her life has become a burning bush, drawing us closer to discover how we too can know Jesus like that. You know, sometimes God has to set His children on fire, so to speak, in order that they might become a light in a dark world. But always His promise is that when you walk through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. And when you walk through fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze, for I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. And her life testifies to that. There's an old hymn that I want to close with this evening, which really is an amazingly biblical hymn. I wish they would write a better tune for it so we could sing it more often. It's got a horrible old tune. But it goes like this. How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in His excellent word. What more can He say than to you He has said, to you who for refuge to Jesus have fled? And then the writer quotes Isaiah 41:10. Fear not, I am with thee. Oh, be not dismayed, for I am thy God and will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee and help thee and cause thee to stand, upheld by my righteous omnipotent hand. And then Isaiah 43:2, when through the deep waters I call thee to go, the rivers of sorrow shall not overflow, for I will be with thee, thy troubles to bless, and sanctify to thee thy deepest distress. Verse 3 of Isaiah 43, when through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. That power of the resurrection. The flame shall not hurt thee. I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. And then Isaiah 46:4, even down to old age, all my people shall prove my sovereign, eternal, unchangeable love. And then when grey hairs shall their temples adorn, like lambs they shall still in my bosom be born. The soul that on Jesus has leaned for repose, I will not desert to his foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never forsake. Or to use the hymn we know much better, from life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand till he returns and calls me home. Here in the power of Christ, I'll stand. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, with Paul this evening, we want to say that we want to know Christ. We long to know you, Lord Jesus, more and more intimately, more and more richly, for our own benefit, but oh God, also so that others may see your glory shining through us. God, we want your light to shine through us. We realize this evening, Lord, that there are no throwaway moments in our lives. That every moment is an opportunity from your hand, whether it's pain or pleasure, whether it's comfort or difficulty, whether it's ease or pain. It's a moment to choose to act as you would, Lord Jesus, and so to burn for you brightly. Oh God, may that be true of our lives. I pray that Isabel Kuhn's life and Paul's desire here in Philippians 3:10 will inspire us and challenge us and move us and motivate us to seek you with all our hearts. For your promise is that if we seek you, we will find you. Oh God, may we count it a high privilege to be placed in the arena, to be a spectacle to the world and to angels, in order that we may be a bush not burned up for your glory. And I pray for any here this evening, Lord, who are on that arena this evening and who need your grace. Won't you come and show them the power of your resurrection tonight, that they may come to know you more deeply, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.